I think you just keep moving. You just gotta always keep moving. And to realize that there really kind of is no failure. You know, maybe that's an aspect of things too, that you know, to kind of watch things become a car crash in slow motion. This collapse, this crash, this, you know, you see everything really falling apart. You know, those are often the moments where there's the most to learn. And you keep working and you work through it and you see where that can take you. And I'm fascinated by failure, and I'm fascinated by trying to take concepts to a point where they break and they collapse or they transform, and to keep pushing that and see where it goes. And you know, I think oftentimes that's where you find the new language. To kind of embark on an artwork that it feels very unknown, and the territory is very uncomfortable, you know, is a really important aspect of art making. And to see what happens, you know, when things collapse and fail. You know, those are conditions, I think, that are essential to making.
Turning thinking into doing, you make a work of art. Where does an idea come from?
When you see a gesture, you're supposed to know what it means. No, you don't. It depends upon who you are, and where you're standing.
We're not these closed systems. We exist as microcosms, universes.
The project Station to Station was really kind of made out of necessity. It was a project that I developed a few years ago, and I felt frustrated with how mediums were so separated, how, you know, art might be over here and music, the culture around music is here, literature, cinema, and all these dialogues were kind of isolated and ghettoized in a way. Yet that never happens. When you sit down and have you know, dinner at a wood table with a friend, the conversation erupts about all these things at once. So I felt like a kind of necessity to do something about that. And I think in some kind of freaky activist way, I wanted to do something that was artist-driven, that was outside of the traditional structures of the museum or the gallery, or for the musician that might be the music industry or the stage. And I thought, you know, if we could do something where there's two principles, one is constant motion and nomadicism, and the other is a complete ignorance of the separation between these mediums. So I thought, you know, if we could do this, how could we be nomadic? Maybe one solution would be, if we could be in motion, we need a moving platform. If we need a moving platform, maybe we could get a train. So we put together this train. It was 15 cars long, and it went from New York to San Francisco. And the journey of Station to Station was a 4,000-mile journey. And over this journey, every location that the train would stop at would be a different train station, from, you know, a tiny rundown place in the desert to, you know, maybe an enormous train station like in Chicago or New York. And the ambition was to use each of these locations like a one-day kunsthalle. And just create a happening. And that happening would be different every time, with different people. Musicians constantly changing, artworks and artists doing new things for this project, and really kind of using this train and the journey of the train as a kind of nomadic studio to create new languages. and to kind of share them and give them away. You know, with the project, we were interested in something that was not a tour. It wasn't a sequence of works that exist being exhibited one after another. We didn't want that. We wanted a kind of living system, and you know, we wanted to kind of create this this platform for things with urgency to happen, and new things, friction, different kinds of energy, and you know, I think that was really the ambition of the project in some ways. And you know, it was this kind of strange thing to create, this kind of Fitzcarraldo in a way, you know, almost kind of, you know, pulling this, you know, boat over a mountain in some ways, in terms of how awkward it was and how you know, strange it was to do a project like that didn't really have a lot of precedent. But I think what happened was, as the project gained momentum, it became owned by everyone who was part of it. And there's that sense of ownership by every individual was really amazing to see. It was this kind of explosion of creativity. And you know, you would have these very diverse encounters.
I am down 5 here, 45, 50, $50 here, 45,
You know, I think that idea to kind of give back the power to author new ideas to the people who are creating is very important, and to, you know, kind of remove as much as you can sometimes the capitalist system which surrounds all the different aspects of culture, you know. And you know, with this project, I was hoping it could be in some ways, you know, a kind of, for a small amount of time, for a certain series of locations, a kind of liberation and a kind of openness between what's being created and the audience, and a space with very little distance between the two.
Who's right, who's like a hero? He's blazing away. Like the stars in the universe.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the idea of dialogue, I think, is incredibly attractive. I've never really seen art as only being a singular thing. And, you know, and I think that goes back to, you know, whether it's the idea of an artwork and how the artwork is encountered. You know, is it something which is, you know, formal and hanging on the wall, and there's a separation between it and you, the viewer? Or is there a chance for engagement, to kind of break the distance and to create something that's immersive or living or time-based? The relationship between you and what you're encountering, how can there be as little distance as possible? And you know, how can that experience have a sense of oneness, and how can it merge? And you know, I think this happens differently in everything that you make or you encounter. And a project like Station to Station was, you know, looking at this idea of really creating these crossovers and these collaborations, and not only letting that happen with who is maybe creating on stage, but also with the audience, and creating a kind of oneness and a sense of ownership of every encounter. And the Station to Station project, you know, after this kind of sequence of happenings over the continent, we had been filming for much of the entire journey. And I thought, you know, is there a way to really kind of, you know, share this project, to kind of give it away, to just like further democratize it, and just, you know, give these encounters and moments in time away to, you know, someone who wasn't there, or now that this time has passed us by. So we set about creating a film, and it was really weird because I've never really wanted to make a movie. I always thought a movie was kind of this other thing over here, which is it's not really my language so much. But with Station to Station, the project was so diverse. There were so many voices in it that I realized that the best way to communicate that was to actually take the most conservative route, which was to make a film, a movie, and you can just sit down in a theater and just watch this thing. But as we started editing it, at first we started making something that was, sort of a documentary. And you're watching this documentary, and it's in chronological order, and there's a voiceover. And I thought, this is just totally corrupt. This has nothing to do with the integrity of what the project really is. And I thought, the project is really, it's really about like these kind of explosions, like a sequence of explosions. And some of these explosions aren't loud; they're incredibly private or internal. Or other ones deal with landscape, or an old architect in the middle of the desert struggling to create a utopian village. Like these very diverse things. So I thought, let's just abort this documentary idea, throw away the footage, and let's start again. And what if we can take time itself, because film is really time, and democratize time? And what if we say every minute, every 60 seconds is an entirely different film, and we just create 62 films, and that becomes the feature. And it was an unorthodox idea, and for a long time as we were working on it, I could see it constantly collapsing. It just didn't hold together, and it was very difficult to follow. And then at a certain point, I recognized that what we were making didn't really have a lot to do with film. It had much more to do with music. And I started listening to musical structure and applying that to this, film made of short 1-minute films. And I saw it almost like notes. And I saw it where, a sequence of notes could lead to another pattern, to another pattern, to another pattern, and eventually you kind of fall into this space where you're kind of in the present, and every minute is kind of a different present and a different perspective on a similar subject or landscape. Track when you're making something? I don't think you do. I think a lot of times, that's what keeps you addicted and coming back for more, or is that sense of trying to discover where you're positioned, and you're almost excavating an idea, and you're kind of trying to dig out this concept so it becomes more clear and crystalline for yourself. And I think that process is really often where much of an artwork is created. I'd read that Hitchcock would storyboard his entire films in advance, and then he would said, it's just an illustration. Making the film is just an illustration of these storyboards. And I always thought that was such bullshit. To do that then just becomes a waste of time. If there's not a sense of a kind of discovery and restlessness in the process, then why make it? And so I think that there has to be that component. There has to be that component of going into a place where you don't fully know. It's not fully mapped out. And in that way, then, the kind of the work that the process requires is able to kind of bring about different encounters or revelations than you could have ever foreseen. I think in many ways the creative process is almost similar to a tree, and you know, you see that things are always moving, they're always developing, but also there's this possibility to kind of move out in one limb, one branch, and go very far in one direction, and that might be a medium, like a happening that's communal with a lot of people involved, while at the same time there might be another branch which is something which is completely singular. It might be a single sculpture that you're working on for a period of time. And for me, I've always felt more comfortable when there's a kind of multiplicity of things happening. And then you have this kind of, you have this system at work where things cross-pollinate, and different ideas or concepts or projects kind of inform one another. And you create a system where it's more advantageous to take greater risks and to experiment in more extreme ways. You know, Terry's, I think, 81 years old now, and he plays approximately 16 hours a day, music 16 hours a day. And, you know, when he talks about playing music, you know, for him, he calls it the flow. And he says, you know, I have to be playing, and it doesn't matter if anyone's around. I can be completely alone. He lives up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And, you know, often, you know, I think weeks on end, you know, there's nobody around, and he's just making music and making music. But it's that kind of necessity that one keeps doing it so that you can further this idea of the language that you're creating. And I think that's a very interesting place, you know, when it's not about compartmentalization, it's not about a concept and executing that concept and being finished, you know, it's something different. Yeah, in the work Migration, we kind of created a road trip almost that went from city to city, town to town, and in each location we would film inside a hotel or motel room. You know. Hotel rooms were cheap, roadside motels, you know, the kind that would be very repetitious. Every room kind of looks the same. And in each of these locations, we would reintroduce a different indigenous animal. In a work like this, it was kind of looking at the idea of a landscape which was created and authored by humans, but the humans had ceased to exist. And there was this kind of almost evolutionary cycle where the animals had re-inhabited these spaces and they were reclaiming them and kind of, you know, existing within the synthetic world that we've made, but following a kind of very feral evolutionary instinct. I don't find that I'm really sticking around too long to, you know, see what a response to an artwork is, because often you've moved on to something else that you're making. And, you know, oftentimes also, you know, when you don't really complete a work, the work completes itself. And I think if you're lucky with a work has kind of, the artwork has kind of taken over at a certain point, and it's determined when it's complete, and then it no longer needs you, and it's able to kind of, you know, perhaps live on its own for a little bit. And you know, at that point, you know, you're usually already, you've also moved on. It's a kind of like incredibly intimate relationship that suddenly that person's no longer there, and that person will live with you forever, but you never need to see them again or talk to them again, and you're on to different discussions. I think the process of making work is really kind of different every time. You know, there's projects that you work on for 5, 6, 7 years, and you're kind of slowly working on this thing, and there's a very different engagement there than something where you're living and breathing the work for several months, and you can't escape it, and it haunts you day and night. And you know, so the process is always very different. And I think in that ways that maybe the process of art making is very porous, and it just kind of seeps into everything you see around you, how you live, what you do. You can't really escape it. And you know, and at a certain point, there's nothing to escape, because it just is.
Not slow down. I like to see and look. You got to be sharp. You got to run as fast as you can all of the time. You can't stop.
The work I Am In You is a multi-channel installation, and the work is really kind of explores the idea of a perpetual present, and in it there's a kind of narrative of a young girl who's kind of constantly discovering newness. Everything around her is kind of as if it's seen for the first time. So it's really, you know, in this work you see her life kind of divided into a series of chapters, and you know, things kind of border in a space, a kind of twilight between fiction and nonfiction. You're not quite sure what's absolutely real and what's psychological space. And eventually this single day that the piece creates, it moves towards night, and eventually this, you know, young woman becomes tired and goes into her bed. And the moment she kind of shuts her eyes and dozes off, you see the house itself that she's in, severed from the foundation. The foundation is sawed off, and the house is hoisted up, and the house is hoisted onto the highway, and it starts moving through darkness down the freeways in the evening while she's asleep. I was interested in this idea of a kind of nomadic state, idea of a kind of a culture where the sense of home is really just kind of a question, really, and you know, presents something that's more about displacement and nomadicism and continuous movement. Language in the work is really communicated through kind of quiet whispers, and a use of language almost as if you were talking to oneself. And in it, I found that I wasn't really interested in kind of enormous amount of dialogue. I was more fascinated by these small repeating verses, almost kind of modern haikus, and you know, a kind of distillation of language as opposed to using it in a maximal way. In the work, there's a sense of geometry, and I saw it as almost kind of creating this neurological mapping, this idea of the mind creating a kind of sense of order and structure throughout the surroundings, which are often random and chaotic, and this idea that you kind of take this very nonlinear sense of experiences and you kind of pull it into a structure. And in some ways, maybe that structure becomes distinctly you, and it separates you from other individuals, how you take it in, not what you take in necessarily. So, I think the work is really, it's filmed to be almost a series of short stories and short chapters of experience that eventually create this kind of larger, singular landscape, which is, in this case, time, a finite period of time. Everything around us all the time is so interesting and foreign that there's never really, to me, there's never really a place you go for inspiration, or there's not really like kind of one moment of lightning striking. It's in the details, it's in the macro, it's in the micro view. It's in word in every sentence that you use, and it's also in how strange it is that we're sitting in Norway right now in the snow.